One evening, my friends Jeff and Dave and I were hanging out at a bar, enjoying a few drinks. At some point, nature called, and I headed to the bathroom. While in one of the stalls, I noticed some faded writing on the door. It read, "Follow the arrows." I looked around but didn't see any arrows, so I brushed it off and returned to our table. Hours passed. After a few more drinks, I needed to use the bathroom again. As I walked in, my shoulder accidentally hit the light switch, plunging the room into pitch blackness. That's when I saw it above my head, glowing faintly in the darkness, was a trail of arrows painted on the ceiling. They looked old, the kind of glow-in-the-dark paint that you'd think would fade after decades. My curiosity sparked. Where could these arrows lead? I hurried back to Jeff and Dave, sharing my strange discovery. They were intrigued, their tipsy excitement matching my own. We decided to investigate further. I went home briefly and grabbed my black light, a small flashlight that reveals hidden things invisible to the naked eye. When I returned to the bar, it was almost closing time. Jeff and Dave were waiting, eager and impatient. We went back to the bathroom and I tested the black light on the painted arrows. They glowed brilliantly. The trail of arrows didn't end in the bathroom. The glowing path continued, leading us out of the restroom, across the bar, and finally out onto the dimly lit street. Holding my black light inches from the ground, I swept the area, revealing more arrows. We followed them, bending close to the pavement, the faint glow drawing us further into the quiet night. Block after block, the arrows guided us. We passed darkened storefronts and silent alleyways. It was unsettling. The city around us seemed abandoned, too quiet. Finally, the arrows turned, pointing us toward a long abandoned driveway. At the end was a tall metal gate, rusted but imposing, enclosing a desolate lot. Jeff pushed the gate. It was locked. "Let's climb over," he said. Without waiting, he scaled the gate, pulling himself over. I shoved the black light into my pocket and followed, with Dave giving me a push from below. Once over, Dave scaled the gate with a surprising agility. Inside, the lot was eerie. Cracks in the pavement sprouted weeds, and the air smelled faintly of decay. My black light quickly picked up another arrow, leading us deeper into the lot. Eventually, we came upon a decrepit shack standing in the middle of the ruins, the paint peeling and boards nailed haphazardly over its windows. Dave squinted at it. "This used to be a drive-in theater," he said, gesturing toward faded lettering on the wall that read, "Popcorn." "But why would the arrows lead us here?" Jeff muttered. Circling the shack, we found a door secured with an old combination padlock. My black light revealed a glowing series of numbers scrawled on the door. 1356. Jeff entered the code. With a satisfying click, the padlock popped open and the door creaked as it swung inward. Jeff peered inside. "I can't see anything," he whispered. I shined my black light into the darkness, but the glow didn't penetrate far. Just as I was about to suggest leaving and returning better prepared, Dave found a light switch and flipped it on. A dim bulb flickered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the interior. The space felt wrong. Dust covered every surface, yet faint footprints disturbed the grime and odd patterns. Rusted equipment lined the walls, and the air was thick with a metallic tang. Jeff frowned. "This place hasn't been touched in decades." "But the power's still on?" "That's not all," I said, pointing. A fresh arrow was painted on the floor, glowing faintly, leading us further inside. Someone was still paying the bills. That much was clear as we stepped inside. The interior was unnervingly clean, apart from a thin layer of dust, the kind of fine, undisturbed coating you'd expect to find in a sealed tomb. The air was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that made my skin prickle. The shelves were barren, except for a single cabinet standing ominously against the far wall. Dave approached it cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the silence. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled the cabinet open. His sharp intake of breath made us all tense. "Guys, "Look at this," he whispered. The cabinet was packed. Rows of candy boxes sat perfectly arranged, untouched by time. I recognized Cracker Jacks and Hershey's bars, but something was wrong. The packaging wasn't vintage, it looked almost new. Dave reached for a giant box of chocolate, but before we could inspect it further, Jeff's voice cut through the tension. "Guys, over here." He was standing over a hatch in the floor, the wooden door already pulled up. The darkness beneath seemed to pulse, inviting and repelling us in equal measure. "Maybe there's another light down there," Jeff said, his voice tinged with curiosity. Without waiting for an answer, he descended into the void. Dave and I exchanged uneasy glances before following him down the creaking stairs. Halfway down, I heard a click. A weak, flickering light bulb buzzed to life, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. "Found it," Jeff called. The basement was worse than the room above. Rows of empty shelves loomed over us like skeletons, their jagged edges lined with cobwebs. Canvas bags littered the floor, covered in a layer of dust so thick it was like ash. As we moved, the air grew heavier, more suffocating. On one of the shelves, I spotted old film canisters. The titles scrawled on their labels were barely legible, but they seemed to be classic monster movies. My fingers traced over one when a sudden whirring sound made me freeze. It came from near the stairs, a mechanical grinding hum that was terrifyingly familiar, like an electric saw. We spun toward the sound. Above us, the shadow cast by the hatch shifted unnaturally. The whirring stopped, leaving only a deafening silence. Then we saw it. The hatch we had entered through was now blocked by iron bars, thick and unmoving. Jeff bolted up the stairs, shaking the bars violently. "They won't move," he shouted, panic rising in his voice. I joined him, squinting into the darkness. A motorized contraption was mounted to the ceiling, its purpose clear sealing us in. "My black light," I muttered, patting my pockets in vain. I had left it upstairs. Jeff pulled out his phone, its dim light revealing more of the mechanism. A giant metal box hung ominously overhead, humming faintly. There was no obvious way to disable it. A gasp from Dave drew our attention. He had dragged one of the canvas bags into the light and was fumbling with the knot. "Dave, don't." I started, but it was too late. The bag opened, and its contents spilled out just enough for us to see. Dave let out a guttural sound, a mix of a scream and a sob, and staggered back, his hands shaking violently. Jeff and I hesitated, then leaned in closer. It took a moment for my mind to process what I was looking at. Hair, skin, the pale curve of a jawbone. My stomach churned violently, and I doubled over, retching onto the concrete floor. Jeff staggered back, his face pale. "Call the police," he choked. "Call them now." I grabbed Dave by the shoulders as he rocked back and forth, hyperventilating. Around us, the other bags seemed to multiply in the dim light, each one promising a similar horror. There were at least a dozen, maybe more. Jeff finally managed to get through to someone on his phone. He babbled about the bar, the arrows, the fence, and the concession stand. Then he handed the phone to me, ... "Listen," I said, my voice trembling. "There are bodies in bags. Dozens of them. We're trapped." The woman on the other end paused, her tone eerily calm. "Stay where you are," she said. "Help is on the way." But something in her voice chilled me to the bone. It wasn't reassurance, it was something else. Something colder. Something final. "Stay on the line with me and give me your names," the woman on the other end of the phone said, her voice clipped and official. She was our only connection to the outside world, and we obeyed without question, answering everything she asked. The oppressive darkness around us made her calm, detached voice feel like a lifeline. But after the interrogation ended, her tone shifted. "You know," she said, with a sharp edge of condescension, "making prank calls to emergency services is a very serious crime." My blood ran cold. "Ma'am," I pleaded, trying to keep my voice steady, I swear to you, I have never been more serious in my life. Please, send someone. If we're lying, you can arrest us, just send help." Her response was chilling. "Young man, don't you have better things to do on a school night?" And then came the click as she hung up. "She didn't believe us," I whispered, the words trembling from my lips. "Give me the phone," Dave said, his expression hardened. He dialed again, this time addressing the operator with a calm authority that surprised me. "I need to speak to the new Hyde Park police." "No, not 911, I want the local department. This is an emergency." When he was connected, his voice dropped into an eerily deliberate tone. "Officer," he said, "I'd like to report some teenagers causing a disturbance in an abandoned building. They're smashing bottles, wrecking the place. And they dragged a little girl into the basement. It sounds bad, real bad. Someone needs to get here before they hurt her." I stared at him in disbelief, then realized his plan. Brilliant, I thought, almost laughing with relief. Dave gave the officer the location, describing the lot and the building perfectly. After a few more questions, he hung up. "They'll come," he said, his voice resolute. Just then, we heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. The tires crunched over gravel. "That was fast," Dave whispered, hope flickering in his voice. But something about it felt wrong. "That's not the cops," I muttered, dread tightening around my chest. A car door slammed, and heavy footsteps crunched closer. Jeff bolted to the hatch, shouting, "We're down here! Help, please, we're trapped!" The footsteps stopped above us. A shadow loomed over the hatch. A pair of worn work boots and dirty blue jeans appeared at the top of the stairs. Jeff stumbled back, pale as a ghost. I looked up, my breath hitching. A man stood there, broad-shouldered, towering, his face obscured by the shadows. He lit a cigarette, the glow illuminating a flash of wiry beard and sharp eyes. "Excuse me, sir," I began, but he turned and walked away as though we weren't even there. The gravel crunched again, then a heavy dragging sound followed. Whatever he hauled back inside hit the ground with a thud. We watched in horrified silence as he unrolled a large plastic tarp across the iron bars, the material hissing against the metal. A moment later, the sharp rip of duct tape cut through the air. The hatch was sealed shut. Then, the sound began, a steady, high-pitched hiss. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Dave's eyes widened in terror. "Gas," he choked. "He's pumping gas in here." We scrambled, searching desperately for the source, but the fumes were already overwhelming. My head spun and my legs buckled. Jeff collapsed in the corner, and Dave staggered toward him, only to crumple beside him moments later. My vision blurred, my chest heaved. As I slumped to the floor, the faint wail of sirens echoed in the distance, a cruel mockery of hope. And then darkness. When I came to, the concrete beneath me was cold and damp. My limbs felt like lead, my head pounding with every heartbeat. I groaned, struggling to sit up, but my arms gave out. Behind me, a cough broke the silence. I turned sharply, my heart leaping. It was Dave, stirring awake, his face pale and streaked with grime. For a moment, confusion clouded his expression. Then, his eyes met mine, and the reality of our situation crashed over us like a tidal wave. "Dave," I rasped, adrenaline surging. I grabbed his collar, hauling him upright. "We've got to get—" I froze mid-sentence. Above us, faint and deliberate, were voices. Low, murmured conversations, punctuated by occasional laughter. The man wasn't alone, and they were still upstairs. "Excuse me, sir," came a voice from above, calm but commanding. "We've had reports of a disturbance out here. Have you heard anything unusual?" There was a long, unnerving pause. Then, in a low, gravelly baritone, the man responded, "Yes, officer. There are some kids in this place causing a hell of a racket. I came over here to run them off. Do you own this property, sir?" The officer asked, but the man didn't get a chance to answer. I screamed an unrestrained, desperate sound that tore from my throat. Dav joined in, and soon Jeff was shouting too. I bolted up the stairs, pounding on the hatch with my fists like a madman. Below me, Dave grabbed 2 metal film canisters and began smashing them together, creating an ear-splitting clamor. Whatever conversation was happening above us was drowned out by our noise, but then came a sudden heavy thud. The sound of bodies slamming into walls followed grunts, scuffles, curses. Something fell to the floor with a bone-jarring crash. Then, a gunshot. We froze. Another shot rang out, sharp and final. We stood in tense silence, ears straining. Then came a soft moan, followed by a weak, trembling voice. I think I'm hurt," it croaked. I think, and then silence. "Officer!" I screamed again, pounding on the hatch, my voice raw with desperation. There was no reply. Dave's voice broke the tense stillness. "We need to get that hatch open, now." Without hesitation, he ripped a metal bar from one of the shelves, wedging it between the iron bars of the hatch. He pushed with all his might, and I clawed at the plastic tarp sealing us in, tearing at it like a feral animal. Jeff joined in, jamming another piece of metal through the bars, trying to gain leverage. The groan of bending wood filled the air, followed by a loud snap. The hatch and part of its frame swung open slightly, but something heavy on top kept it from fully opening. We pushed together, muscles straining, and finally, whatever was on top of the hatch toppled with a crash. The opening widened just enough for me to poke my head through. The scene above froze me in place. A uniformed police officer lay sprawled on the ground, his lifeless eyes staring directly at me. A kitchen knife protruded grotesquely from the side of his head, the blade glinting dully in the dim light. His hand still clutched his service weapon. Across the room, the hulking man was dragging himself upright. Blood stained his shirt, and his shoulder and leg bore bullet wounds, but his expression was determined, feral. He locked eyes with me for a brief second before his gaze shifted to the hatch. He was coming for us. I stretched my arm through the bars, fingers brushing the officer's gun. My heart pounded as I strained further, the iron biting into my skin. The dying officer, with the last shred of his strength, nudged the weapon closer. My fingers closed around it. Twisting my arm awkwardly, I pointed the gun in the man's direction, but the angle was terrible, obstructed by the hatch. "I've got a gun," I whispered hoarsely to Dave and Jeff. "The cop's gone. He can't help us. The big guy. He's still alive." "How many bullets?" Dave hissed. "I don't know," I whispered. "Maybe none." Dave's eyes darted around, frantic. "If he gets under us," he murmured, "maybe you can shoot through the floor." The man groaned, and we heard his heavy footfalls growing louder. I repositioned the gun, holding my breath as I aimed for where I thought he might appear. Then came a metallic clatter. One of the film canisters shifted, dragged deliberately across the floor. My heart sank as I realized he was toying with us, closing in like a predator savoring the kill. The gunshot was deafening, the small weapon's kick far more punishing than I expected. My ears rang, my wrist throbbed, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. On the other side of the hatch there was a flurry of movement, followed by an ominous creaking sound like a bowstring being pulled taut. Then came the hissing, the gas. Jeff and Dave grabbed at me, pulling with desperate strength to dislodge the iron bars that imprisoned us. Together we pushed, twisted, and yanked at the contraption. At last, a faint groan of shifting metal rewarded our efforts. Dave seized the mechanism on the side, tearing at it furiously, while Jeff and I heaved with all our remaining strength. The bars gave way, and the enormous contraption toppled with a resounding crash. Dave staggered back, coughing violently, but before he could reach us, he crumpled to the floor, the gas overtaking him. The room spun, my lungs burned. Jeff managed to push the hatch aside and climbed out, gasping for air. I tried to follow, but the dizziness overtook me, slowing my movements. That's when I saw him. The hulking man burst from the shadows, his silhouette monstrous against the dim light. His hand clutched a wrench, and before I could shout a warning, he swung it with savage force. Jeff collapsed under the blow, the sickening crack echoing in my skull like a death knell. My mind raced. Where was the gun? I couldn't see it, couldn't think clearly. The gas fogged my thoughts, dulled my senses. I clawed my way out of the hatch, gulping down lungfuls of stale, dusty air. And then he was on me. The wrench connected with my face in a brutal arc, sending me sprawling. Pain exploded through my skull, and my vision blurred as I collapsed, half in and half out of the hatch. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, the gun. Somehow, it had fallen near me in the chaos. Instinct took over. Blindly, I gripped the weapon and swung my arm upward, firing wildly into the dark. I don't know if I hit him. I don't remember the impact. The world spun, then faded completely, dragging me down into nothingness. When I woke, I was being lifted into an ambulance. My body was heavy, unresponsive, my head pounding with a dull, relentless ache. A paramedic leaned over me, her face blurred and distant. "My friends," I croaked, my voice barely audible. "What happened to my friends?" She hesitated, her expression crumpling with pity. "I'm sorry," she murmured, shaking her head. The doors slammed shut, sealing me in a cold, sterile cocoon. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my strength was gone. Darkness claimed me again. 1 year later, I stood at the podium in my best suit, clutching a piece of paper with trembling hands. The memorial service was packed, but the room felt hollow. My voice trembled as I spoke about Dave, brave, selfless Dave, who had faced down death to give us a chance to escape. I spoke of Officer Stanley Bow, a hero who had sacrificed everything, leaving behind a grieving wife and 2 young children. My words sounded alien through the microphone, distorted by the damage to my face. After 2 surgeries, I looked okay, but the injuries had forever altered the way I spoke. When I finished, I stepped down and hugged Dave's mother. She clung to me, her tears soaking into my shoulder, while Dave's father gripped my arm, his sobs choked and broken. After the service, Jeff was waiting on the front steps. The blow to his head had cost him the vision in his left eye. He wore dark sunglasses to mask the milky ruin beneath. We didn't exchange many words. There was nothing left to say. I hugged him tightly, patting his back before walking away. The news had been relentless. 37 bodies. 37 victims, each stuffed into canvas sacks, their deaths spanning decades. The killer had rigged the concession stand with motion sensors and iron bars to trap curious trespassers, while a silent alarm alerted him to their capture. An artist's rendering of his face, based on my fragmented description, plastered every channel. But he was still out there. Still free. That night, I lay in my bedroom, the weight of survival pressing down on me like a stone. My girlfriend slipped in quietly and wrapped her arms around me. She left the light on. She always did now. Because now, I never sleep in the dark.